There is a red dress in a closet in a small Brighton Beach apartment, and an old woman who believes that if she can fit into it again, she will be somebody. There is a young couple in love, and with a plan, a little clothing store sketched out on a kitchen table. There is a pound of pure heroin that will change everything. A phone call inviting a lonely widow onto television. A summer on the Coney Island boardwalk, with the machinery of hope still running. Requiem for a Dream begins in warmth, in appetite, in the ordinary human wish to be loved and seen and lifted out of a small life. Then it takes that wish apart, slowly and then all at once, until four people who only wanted something good are lying curled on their sides in the dark, hollowed out by the very thing that promised to save them. Darren Aronofsky built the film around drugs, but its real subject is the dream itself, and what happens to a person when the dream becomes the hook. Everything that follows is the anatomy of that hook. Section 1. The Writer Who Knew. The Dark Before Requiem for a Dream was a film, it was a novel. And before it was a novel, it was a life. And the life belonged to a man who had already nearly died of the thing the story is about. Hubert Selby Jr. was born in Brooklyn in 1928, the son of a former coal miner from Kentucky who had become a merchant seaman and settled in the Red Hook district. Selby dropped out of school at 15 to work the docks, and in his teens he followed his father to sea with the Merchant Marine. Somewhere in his third year aboard ship, he contracted tuberculosis. By one account, from cattle suffering bovine tuberculosis on the vessel itself, and the disease that took hold of him would shape the rest of his existence more completely than anything he ever chose. He was taken off his ship at Bremen in Germany, told he had only months to live, and shipped back to the United States to die. He did not die, but the cost of not dying was enormous. At a marine hospital in New York, he was treated with streptomycin, an experimental drug at the time, and he underwent surgeries in which surgeons removed something close to 10 of his ribs in order to reach a collapsed lung. He lost one lung entirely and part of the other. He was given morphine for the pain of all this, steadily, over a long convalescence, and the morphine did what morphine reliably does to a body in pain for long enough. By the time he was sent home, he was an opiate user, and the opiate use would mutate over the following years into heroin and alcohol dependence that ran through his life for the better part of 2 decades. He spent much of his 20s bedridden and frail, repeatedly told by doctors that he simply did not have the lung capacity to survive much longer. Those years of enforced stillness, with little to do but read and think, were where the writer in him was made. There is a detail in Selby's biography that gives Requiem for a Dream its title, and a good deal of its sorrow, and it is worth stating plainly, because it explains the strange tenderness underneath a story this brutal. Selby's first dream, before the docks and the sea and the illness, was to become a composer. He had no money for a musical education and no health to pursue one, and so he reasoned in a line that has become part of his legend, that he at least knew the alphabet and might therefore become a writer. The man who would title his masterwork, About Ruined Dreams, Requiem for a Dream, had personally watched his own first dream die in a hospital bed and had built a second life out of the wreckage of it. He published Last Exit to Brooklyn in 1964, a book of linked stories about prostitutes, dock workers, addicts, and the desperate poor of Brooklyn that became internationally notorious and was put on obscenity trial in Britain. He wrote The Room in 1971 and The Demon in 1976. Requiem for a Dream came in 1978, written by his own account in roughly 6 weeks following a near fatal bout of pneumonia, which is to say, it was written by a man who had once again been close enough to death to feel its breath. Selby finally got clean in 1967, after an arrest for heroin possession in Los Angeles and 2 months in the county jail, and he stayed clean for the rest of his life. He died in 2004 at 75 of the chronic lung disease that had been killing him since he was 19. On his deathbed, in real and considerable pain, he refused morphine. A man who had lost most of 2 decades to the opiate that was first put into his body by well-meaning doctors chose, at the very end, to feel the pain rather than take the drug. That choice is not in the film, but it hangs over the film for anyone who knows it, because it is the exact inverse of what every character in Requiem for a Dream is unable to do. The man who turned the novel into a film came from the same borough and a very different starting point. Darren Aronofsky was born in Brooklyn in 1969 and raised around Brighton Beach and Coney Island, the same stretch of faded seaside that the film would later use as its primary landscape. He studied film and social anthropology at Harvard and then directing at the American Film Institute. And his first feature, the black and white thriller Pi, was made in 1997 for around $60,000, financed in part by small donations of $100 each from friends and family. Pi premiered at the Sundance Film Festival in 1998 and won Aronofsky the directing award there, and it was sold to Artisan Entertainment for $1 million. Selby had been one of Aronofsky's literary heroes since his school years. The chance to adapt one of the writer's own books was, for a young director who had just announced himself, the kind of opportunity that does not come twice. Eric Watson, who had produced and co-written Pi, was the one who pushed Aronofsky toward the novel. Selby was receptive. He had always intended the book to become a film, and had written his own screenplay version years earlier, a draft that turned out to be around 80% identical to the one Aronofsky developed, which tells you something about how clearly the structure of the story lived in its author's mind. Aronofsky and Watson optioned the rights for $1,000, a sum that was large for them at the time, and almost comically small for what it bought. The two writers compared their versions and worked the screenplay into final shape together, with Aronofsky pushing to make the younger characters younger still, to sharpen the impact of watching people destroy themselves before they have really begun to live. The financing was difficult. Aronofsky was still in a precarious place after Pi, and backers were nervous about a film whose subject was 4 people being annihilated by addiction with no rescue and no redemption arriving to soften the blow. The film was eventually made for a budget reported at around $4 to $4.5 million, and it was shot over roughly 40 days, from the middle of April to the middle of June in 1999, on location in and around Coney Island, on the boardwalk, and through the dying amusement parks and the apartment blocks of Brighton Beach. The choice of place was not decoration. The neighborhood was where both the director and, in spirit, the story came from, a stretch of New York that had once been a destination for ordinary people seeking a little wonder, and had since slid into something grayer and sadder, a perfect external image for what the film does to the inside of its characters. The casting brought together people who would each give the performance of a lifetime, though several of them had to be persuaded. A number of established actresses were approached for the role of Sarah Goldfarb and turned it down, among them Faye Dunaway, on account of how punishing the material was. Ellen Burstyn herself initially declined for the same reason and changed her mind only after her Manager urged her to watch Aronofsky's earlier work. Jared Leto took the role of Harry after others had passed. Jennifer Connelly came aboard as Marion. Drawn by a screenplay she found brave and unusual. Marlon Wayans, known at the time mainly for comedy, read the novel 3 times and auditioned 5 times before he was given the part of Tyrone, hungry for the chance to do something nobody expected of him. What every one of them signed up for was a film that would ask them to go further into degradation and despair than almost any mainstream American picture had asked its actors to go. The film that resulted is fiction. The 4 people at its center never existed. But the world it draws from is meticulously, painfully real, and the writer who first imagined it had lived inside that world for years and barely walked out. This is the spine of everything that comes next. The polished screen surface, the dazzling editing, and the famous music and the unforgettable images sits on top of a documented reality of what addiction actually does to a body and a mind and a family. And the gap between how the dream feels and what the dream costs is the subject the film never stops examining. Selby knew that gap from the inside. He had wanted to be a composer, had lost his lungs to a cattle ship, had spent years on morphine and heroin, and had survived to write a Requiem, which is a piece of music for the dead, for the dreams that do not survive the people who carry them. It is worth lingering on the kind of writer Selby was, because the texture of his prose shaped the texture of the film. Last Exit to Brooklyn was published by Grove Press in 1964, the same house that had taken on the most legally embattled literature of the era, and it brought down on Selby a notoriety that few American novels have matched. The book became the subject of a celebrated obscenity prosecution in Britain and was banned outright in Italy, and the controversy fixed Selby in the public mind as a writer of the lower depths, a chronicler of prostitutes and addicts, and the brutalized poor, whom respectable literature preferred not to see. His style was as confrontational as his subject matter. He wrote without conventional quotation marks, letting dialogue run into narration without the usual signposts, using slashes in place of apostrophes, and stretching paragraphs into long, unbroken rushes of voice. The effect on the page was breathless and claustrophobic, a prose that refused to give the reader anywhere comfortable to stand, and it carried directly into the experience of the film, which likewise refuses the viewer any safe distance from what it shows. There is a small recurring detail across Selby's books that points to how personal the material always was for him. His central male characters are very often named Harry. There is a Harry in Last Exit to Brooklyn, a Harry at the center of The Demon, and Harry Goldfarb at the heart of Requiem for a Dream. The name follows him from book to book like a signature, a private mark of how close the author stood to the men he was writing about. And it is the name Aronofsky, and the film kept for the young man whose arm the heroine would eventually take. The director who took up this material had announced himself only 2 years earlier with a film made on almost nothing. Pi was shot in late 1997 on a budget of around $60,000, financed in part by donations of $100 each from roughly 600 friends and family members, to each of whom Aronofsky promised $150 in return. If the film made money and a screen credit if it did not, the gamble paid off. Pi won Aronofsky the directing award at Sundance in 1998, was sold to Artisan Entertainment for around $1 million, took an Independent Spirit Award for its screenplay, and grossed several times its tiny cost. Aronofsky came to Requiem for a Dream as a young filmmaker with a reputation for doing a great deal with very little, and an appetite for the kind of formal experiment that frightened more cautious directors. His influences, by his own account, ran from Akira Kurosawa and Roman Polanski to Terry Gilliam, the Japanese filmmakers Shinya Tsukamoto and Satoshi Kon, and his fellow Brooklyn native Spike Lee, whose She's Gotta Have It he had stumbled into as a teenager after another film sold out, an accident that helped convince him a person from his neighborhood could actually make movies. Selby sat on that list of influences too, which meant the adaptation was, for Aronofsky, a chance to work directly with one of the writers who had made him. The casting that finally came together did so only after a string of refusals that would have produced a very different film. Beyond the established actresses who turned down Sarah, the three young leads were nearly other people entirely. Giovanni Ribisi was considered for Harry, Neve Campbell for Marion, and Dave Chappelle for Tyrone. And all three passed before Leto, Connolly, and Wayans took the roles. The producers and the director also disagreed about the ages of the characters. Aronofsky wanted the young trio cast as young as possible, to sharpen the horror of watching people ruined before they had really begun, while the producers worried that making them too young would tip the film past what an audience could bear. And Aronofsky agreed to compromise. The finished film was made for a budget reported between $4 and $4.5 million, premiered out of competition at Cannes in May of 2000. Opened in the United States that October through Artisan and went on to take in around $7 million, a modest theatrical figure for a work whose real audience would find it slowly, over years, on home video. One last piece of context belongs here, because it measures the gap between the film's prestige and its punishing reputation. Ellen Burstyn was not a newcomer being asked to carry a difficult role. She was already an Academy Award winner, having taken the Best Actress prize in 1974 for Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore, and she was being asked to spend a film being made physically and emotionally unrecognizable in the service of a story most actors of her stature would not have touched. That a performer of that standing committed so completely to Sarah Goldfarb tells you something about what the people who made the film believed they were making. They were not making a shock piece. They were making a serious work about the most ordinary kind of human longing and the way it can be turned into a weapon, built on a novel by a man who had lost most of his lungs and most of 2 decades to the reality it describes, and they treated it with the gravity that belief demanded. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Selby survived the dream that nearly killed him and turned the wreckage into a book. Aronofsky turned the book into something that moves and breathes and accelerates. Next, the focus turns to the 4 people at the center of it and to the small, bright wishes that will quietly become the instruments of their ruin. Section 2. 4 Dreams. On the boardwalk, Requiem for a Dream is built around 4 people, and the architecture of the film is the way their separate stories are braided together until they fall apart in the same rhythm at the same time. There is Sarah Goldfarb, an aging widow living alone in an apartment near the Coney Island boardwalk, played by Ellen Burstyn. There is her son Harry, played by Jared Leto, a young man with a heroin habit and a warm, charming, fundamentally weak nature. There is Harry's girlfriend Marion Silver, played by Jennifer Connelly, who comes from money she has cut herself off from, and who wants to design clothes and open a shop. And there is Harry's closest friend Tyrone C. Love, played by Marlon Wayans, who dreams of making enough money to escape the streets and to stand in front of his mother as a man she can be proud of. 4 people, 4 dreams, and the film's argument is that the dreams and the drugs are the same machinery running in 4 different directions. The film is divided into 3 movements named for seasons: summer, fall, winter. The choice is deliberate, and it does a great deal of quiet work because it lets the audience feel a downhill slope built into the calendar itself. Summer is warmth and possibility, the season when every one of the 4 still believes the dream is reachable and the cost is manageable. Fall is the turn, the first chill, the early signs that the math is not working out the way anyone planned. Winter is the bottom, the cold, the place where each character arrives at the end of the line. There is no spring. The film offers no 4th season, no thaw, no return. The structure tells the ending before the story does, for anyone willing to notice that the calendar has been built to run out. The opening sequence introduces the central relationship of the family, with an economy that is almost cruel. Harry has come to his mother's apartment to take her television set again, so that he can pawn it for drug money. Sarah knows this. She has been through it before. The film splits the screen so that mother and son occupy the same frame while remaining divided by a hard vertical line down the middle of it, present together and separated at the same instant. Sarah, frightened of her own son, locks herself behind a chained door. Harry talks to her gently through the gap, takes the television, and wheels it down the street to the same pawnbroker who has clearly seen this transaction many times. The pawnbroker, played by Mark Margolis, hands over the cash, and later Sarah will simply walk down and buy the set back, a small ritual of mutual harm that both of them have learned to absorb. In a few minutes, the film has shown a mother and a son who love each other and are already in small ways feeding on each other. Coney Island itself is the 5th character of the opening movement. The boardwalk, the beach, the parachute jump tower, the amusement rides, all of it once stood for a kind of cheap, democratic wonder, a place where working people went to feel briefly weightless. By the time the film was shot, the area had been in long decline, and Aronofsky uses that decline without comment, simply letting the camera move through a landscape of faded color and worn surfaces. Sarah sits on the boardwalk in the sun with her friends Ada and Ray, women her own age who gather in folding chairs to gossip and bask and watch the day go by. The brightness of these early scenes is real. The film is not pretending the summer is grim. It needs the summer to be genuinely sweet so that the loss of it will register, and so the boardwalk in the first movement glows with a warmth that the later movements will systematically drain away. Aronofsky has been clear about the idea at the heart of the film, and it is the idea that makes the structure work. He has said that the same inner monologue runs through the head of a person trying to quit cigarettes, a woman starving herself to fit a dress, and a man chasing the next bag of heroin, and that putting those experiences side by side was something he had not seen done on film. The traditional heroine story belongs to Harry, Marion, and Tyrone. The unexpected addition is Sarah, whose drug arrives in the form of prescription diet pills, and whose deeper addiction is to a dream of being seen and admired again. When the film lays Sarah's decline beside the younger character's descent into heroin, it forces a question that most addiction stories never ask, which is what a drug actually is, and whether the chemical is the disease or only the most visible symptom of it. The film's answer is that the hunger comes first and the substance comes second, and that the hunger is universal. Each of the 4 dreams is, on its own terms, modest and sympathetic. Sarah wants to be invited onto a television show she loves, and to wear her red dress and to hear her friends tell her she looks wonderful. There is nothing monstrous in that. Harry and Marion want to start a small business together, a store for Marion's clothing designs, and to build an ordinary shared life around it. Tyrone wants money and dignity and an escape from a corner that has nothing to offer him, and he carries the memory of his mother as the standard he is trying to live up to. None of these is a grand or corrupt ambition. They are the kinds of things people are supposed to want. The horror of the film is precisely that it takes the most reasonable wishes a person can have and shows how the means each character chooses to chase them turns the wish into a trap. The film also establishes early that addiction here is a family inheritance and a social condition, not merely a private failing. Harry learns something about escape and avoidance in the apartment he grew up in, from a mother who medicates her loneliness with television and food, and, soon, with pills. Tyrone's drive is shaped by poverty and by the absence and idealization of his mother. Marion's slide is fed by an estrangement from wealthy parents who, the film implies, gave her money instead of attention. The documented reality that addiction tends to run in families, to clusters with poverty and isolation and untreated pain, is woven into the characters without ever being announced as a thesis. The film shows it rather than stating it, in the way Harry and Sarah mirror each other, in the way each character is reaching past an emptiness towards something that looks like it might fill the whole. What gives the first movement its terrible suspense on a second viewing is that the audience already knows the ground is rigged. The seasons are going to run out. The dreams are going to curdle. The warmth of the boardwalk is on loan. But the characters do not know this. They are living inside the part of addiction that feels like hope. The early stretch where the substance and the dream are still delivering, where the energy is up and the future looks open and the cost has not yet come due. Aronofsky films this stretch honestly, with real light and real affection. Because the film cannot make its argument unless it first shows why anyone would walk down this road. People do not pursue ruin. They pursue relief and pleasure, and the feeling of becoming the person they hoped to be. The drug, whatever form it takes, keeps that promise just long enough to make itself necessary. By the close of the summer movement, the pieces are in place. Sarah has her dream of television. Harry and Marion have their dream of the store, and a stash of heroin and money beginning to grow. Tyrone has his ambition and his loyalty to Harry. Everyone is, briefly, winning. The film has assembled 4 ordinary hungers and 4 available means of feeding them, and it has set a clock running that the audience can feel even if the characters cannot. The next movements will show the means consuming the hungers, the dreams consuming the dreamers, and the warm, crowded summer narrowing down, character by character, into 4 separate rooms of cold. The place where all of this unfolds carries a history that deepens the film's meaning for anyone who knows it. Coney Island was once the great democratic pleasure ground of the United States, a stretch of Brooklyn shoreline that drew enormous crowds of working people to its beaches and its grand amusement parks. Places built to sell ordinary people a few hours of wonder they could not find anywhere else in their lives. By the time the film was shot, that golden era was long gone. The great parks had burned or closed, the crowds had thinned, and the boardwalk had settled into a faded, weathered version of its former self, still standing, still operating, but visibly diminished. Aronofsky, who grew up in its shadow, films this decline without a word of editorializing. He simply lets the camera move through a landscape that, was built to manufacture dreams for the masses and has since become a monument to dreams that did not last, which makes it the most fitting possible setting for a story about exactly that. The pawn shop transaction that opens the film establishes a ritual that defines the Goldfarb family before any larger plot has begun. Harry takes the television. The pawnbroker, played by Mark Margolis in one of his several collaborations with Aronofsky, hands over the cash with the weary familiarity of a man who has done this with these two people many times. And then Sarah, rather than reporting her son or refusing to participate, simply walks down to the same shop and buys the set back. The loop closes. The television returns to its place in her apartment. The money returns to the pawnbroker, and the whole exchange resets, ready to happen again. It is a small machine of mutual harm that the mother and son have built together over years, each one feeding the other's need at a cost to themselves. And it tells the audience everything about the family dynamic the rest of the film will explore. The television is not just an appliance to Sarah. It is her window onto the bright world she wants to rejoin, the companion that fills her silent rooms, and the fact that her own son keeps taking it from her, and that she keeps paying to get it back, is a portrait of love and dependency, tangled together so tightly that neither can be pulled free of the other. The structure that braids the four stories together is inherited directly from the novel, where Selby moved among the same set of characters and let their separate descents echo one another. The film makes this braiding into a formal principle. From early on, it cuts among the four lives in a way that invites the audience to feel their fundamental similarity, the common engine running beneath their very different surfaces. Sarah in her apartment with her pills and her television, Harry and Marion in their bed with their heroin and their plans, Tyrone on the corner with his ambition and his memory of his mother. All of them are filmed as variations on a single theme, and the editing keeps reminding the viewer of that kinship, even when the characters themselves have no idea how alike they are. This is the structural expression of Aronofsky's central idea, the conviction that the same inner monologue runs through every one of them, regardless of which substance or dream they happen to be chasing. One of the most striking choices the film makes in this opening stretch is its complete refusal to supply a villain among the four. There is no dealer figure presented as the corrupting outsider. No moral monster onto whom the audience can offload responsibility for what happens. The pushers and pimps and predatory figures who appear later are real, but they are circumstances rather than causes, part of the landscape the characters move through rather than the engine of their ruin. The engine is internal. It is the hunger each character carries, and the substance each one finds to feed it. And the film locates the danger inside the wanting itself, rather than in any external agent of corruption. This is part of why the film delivers no lectures and stages no speeches about the evils of drugs. It does not need to. It simply shows four people pursuing reasonable wishes through ruinous means, and lets the structure carry the argument. The clinical, almost documentary quality that observers have noted in the film comes from exactly this restraint, this willingness to lay the lives side by side and let the audience draw the conclusion. For the restraint to work, the summer has to be genuinely warm, and it is. The film commits fully to the early pleasures of these lives. The boardwalk glows, the friendships feel real. The young couple's tenderness is unforced, and the dream of the store seems, for a while, like something they might actually build. Sarah's first taste of energy and hope is filmed with real lightness. The film needs all of this to be true and felt, because the argument it is building depends on the audience understanding that nobody walks toward ruin on purpose. They walk toward warmth, toward relief, toward the version of themselves they hope to become. And the warmth is real right up until the moment it begins to cost more than it gives. The summer movement is the bait. The film lays it out honestly, lets the audience feel the pull of it, and only then begins to spring the trap that the calendar, with its 3 seasons and no fourth, has been promising from the start. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. 4 people, 4 dreams, 1 summer that still felt full of promise and light. The brightest and most ordinary of those dreams belonged to an old woman sitting alone in front of a television set. In the next section, we go to Sarah Goldfarb and the red dress she came to believe could give her back her life. Section 3, Sarah Goldfarb and the red dress. The most quietly devastating of the 4 stories belongs to the one character who never touches heroin. Sarah Goldfarb is an elderly widow who lives by herself in a small apartment near the boardwalk, and the film establishes the shape of her life before it establishes her dream, because the dream only makes sense against the emptiness it is trying to fill. Her husband, Seymour, is dead. Her son, Harry, comes around mainly to take her television. Her days are structured around almost nothing. She watches an infomercial-style program hosted by a relentlessly upbeat self-help figure named Tappy Tibbins, played by Christopher McDonald, a man who bellows about willpower and being a winner and joining the month of fury. And she eats, and she sits on the boardwalk with Ada and Ray, and she waits for a life that is no longer arriving. Ellen Burstyn plays her with a warmth and a vulnerability that make the loneliness feel enormous and specific rather than generic. Then the phone rings, and a voice tells Sarah that she has been selected to appear on television. The film is deliberately ambiguous about what this call actually is. It may be a marketing scam designed to sell her something. It may be a prank. It may be a misunderstanding. And there is a reading in which it is partly a creation of Sarah's own need, a hope she inflates into a certainty because she cannot bear to let it go. The public record on the film treats the invitation as most likely a scam or a delusion that never had any real chance of coming true, and the film never resolves the question. What matters is what the call does to Sarah. It gives her a future. It gives her a reason to get out of the chair. For the first time in the film, she has something to move toward, and the something is the chance to be looked at and admired by an audience of strangers. To be, in the word she keeps returning to, somebody. The red dress is the physical form the dream takes. It is the dress Sarah wore to Harry's high school graduation, a marker of the last time her life felt full, when she had a husband and a son and a role and a future. She decides she will wear it on television. The problem is that she no longer fits into it. And so the dream of being seen becomes a project of the body, a campaign to lose enough weight to zip up a dress that represents a version of herself she has lost. There is something universally recognizable in this. Sarah is not chasing a high. She is chasing an image of who she used to be and a hope of being valued again. And the dress is the gate she has to pass through to get there. The film treats this with complete seriousness. It does not mock her. The dream is small and a little sad and entirely human, and that is exactly why what happens to it lands the way it does. Burstyn's commitment to charting Sarah's physical disintegration was extraordinary and is well documented in accounts of the production. To show Sarah's weight loss across the film, the actress wore two separate fat suits, one simulating roughly 40 additional pounds and one roughly 20, so that the character could visibly shrink as the story progressed. During a 2-week break in the shooting schedule, Burstyn also dieted to lose around 10 pounds of her own. The makeup team built her a series of wigs and prosthetic necks, 9 wigs and 4 necks, by the accounts of the production. Some of the appliances taking up to 4 hours to apply each day. Burstyn later said the role challenged her more than anything she had done, more even than her work on The Exorcist, and the strain shows on screen in the best possible sense, because Sarah's deterioration feels like something happening to a real body over real time rather than a costume change. Before the pills enter the story, the film spends time inside the texture of Sarah's isolation, and this is essential to understanding why the dream takes hold of her so completely. She lives alone with a television that talks at her and does not listen. She has friends, but the friendships are built around surfaces, around appearance and gossip, and the small competitive comparisons that the women make on the boardwalk. The arrival of the television invitation transforms Sarah's standing among Ada and Ray instantly. Suddenly she is the one with news, the one with a future, the one the others want to hear from. The admiration she gets simply for having been invited is itself a drug, a first taste of the attention she has been starving for, and it raises the stakes of the dream enormously. To lose the dream now would not just mean staying home. It would mean losing the new respect, sliding back into being the lonely widow nobody calls. The early crash diet, before the prescription, is its own small portrait of how a reasonable goal becomes a fixation. Sarah tries to eat less and finds it unbearable. The film stages her hunger as a near hallucinatory torment. The refrigerator, looming in the corner of the room, the grapefruit and the boiled egg and the black coffee, failing utterly to quiet the craving. This is one of the places where Aronofsky's central idea becomes visible. The inner experience of Sarah fighting her appetite is filmed with the same intensity as the younger characters fighting their drug cravings, because the experiences are, at the level of the nervous system, closely related. Hunger is a powerful drive. Loneliness sharpens it. A person trying to override appetite through willpower alone, with nothing else in their life to lean on, is in a genuinely difficult fight, and Sarah is losing it. When her friend Ray mentions a doctor who can help with the weight, the suggestion arrives as a rescue. That doctor, and the pills he prescribes, will be the subject of the next section, because the medical reality behind them deserves its own careful telling. What matters here is the emotional ground the pills land on. Sarah does not seek out drugs. She seeks out a way to fit into a dress so that she can appear on television and be admired, and the way she is offered comes wrapped in the full authority of a physician and a prescription. There is nothing in Sarah's world that warns her. The doctor does not warn her. The culture she lives in has been telling women for generations that there is a pill to make the weight go away. She takes what she is given, in the doses she is told to take, and at first it works exactly as advertised. The weight begins to fall off. The energy floods in. The dream moves closer. The cruelty of Sarah's arc, the thing that separates it from a simple cautionary tale, is that her addiction grows out of the most legitimate parts of her. She is not weak or foolish. She is lonely, and she is grieving a life that ended when her husband died, and her son grew into a stranger, and she is reaching for connection in the only direction that has opened up to her. When Harry, later in the film, sees what the pills are doing to her and begs her to stop, She answers him with a speech that is one of the most quietly heartbreaking moments in the film. She tells him, in essence, that the prospect of being on television, of wearing the red dress, of having Ada and Ray admire her, and having a reason to smile and get up in the morning is what she has left. She tells him that she is somebody now. The pills are not the point for Sarah. The point is the reason to live that they seem to have given her, and asking her to give up the pills sounds, to her, like asking her to give up the only future she has been able to find. This is what makes Sarah the secret center of the whole film. The three young people are chasing pleasure and escape and money, and their story, while harrowing, follows a recognizable shape. Sarah is chasing meaning. She wants her life to matter again, to be witnessed, to be loved. The film places her beside the heroin users, not to equate her morally with them, but to reveal that the engine underneath all four of them is the same. Each is trying to fill an absence. Each has found a substance that fills it for a while, and then begins to demand everything in return. And Sarah's absence is the largest and the most ordinary of them all, because it is the absence that waits for almost everyone who lives long enough. The slow shrinking of a life as the people and the roles that gave it shape fall away. The red dress is her way of refusing that shrinking. The tragedy is the way the refusal destroys her. The television program that organizes Sarah's days deserves a closer look because it is the cultural machine that primes her for everything that follows. The host, Tappy Tibbins, played by Christopher McDonald, with a glittering, predatory enthusiasm, runs a program that is part game show and part self-help revival meeting. He bellows about willpower and winning, leads his studio audience through chants, promises that anyone can be transformed if they simply commit to his program, that they can join what he calls the month of fury and master their appetites and become winners. He preaches a gospel of total self-control, of mind over body, of the idea that the only thing standing between a person and the life they want is their own failure to want it badly enough. Sarah absorbs this gospel daily from her chair, and it shapes the way she understands her own struggle. When she fights her hunger and loses, she does not conclude that the goal is unreasonable. She concludes that she has failed to be a winner, that she needs more help mastering herself. And that conclusion is exactly the frame of mind in which a prescription for appetite-suppressing pills sounds like the missing piece. The self-help culture beaming into her apartment has taught her to see her own body as an enemy to be conquered, and the pills arrive as the weapon the gospel promised. The loneliness that makes all of this possible is not a private quirk of Sarah's, but a documented condition that affects enormous numbers of older people, and the film's portrait of it is clinically precise. Sarah is a widow whose husband is gone, and whose only child visits mainly to take from her. Her days have lost their structure. Her social world has shrunk to a few women on a boardwalk. The literature on aging describes exactly this kind of isolation as a serious risk to health, linking chronic loneliness in older adults to depression, to cognitive decline, and to elevated rates of illness and early death. A person in Sarah's situation is not merely sad. She is in a state that medicine recognizes as genuinely dangerous, a slow erosion of the connections and the sense of purpose that keep a person well. And into that erosion, the film introduces first a dream and then a drug. Burstyn understood this, and she prepared for the role by spending time in Brooklyn, learning about the narrow lives of women like Sarah. Women whose existence, as she described it, had contracted to the daily work of putting food on the table, and little else. The performance carries that research in its bones. Sarah's loneliness never feels like an actor's choice. It feels like a documented reality observed from close range and reproduced with care. The film draws a quiet, devastating line between Sarah and her son. And the line is the key to understanding her, not as an isolated case, but as part of a pattern. Harry is a heroin addict. Sarah is about to become an amphetamine addict. Both of them are medicating an absence. Both are reaching past an emptiness towards something that promises to fill it. The apartment Harry grew up in was presided over by a mother who soothed her loneliness with television and food. And the film implies, without ever stating it, that Harry learned something in that apartment about how a person manages pain, which is to find a substance that quiets it, and to keep returning to that substance as the quiet wears off. The mother and son are running the same program with different chemicals. When Harry later sees the pills doing to Sarah what heroin has done to him, his horror is partly the horror of recognition, the sickening realization that he is watching his own disease appear in the one person he did not want to see it in. The family pattern that the film traces is one of the most documented features of addiction, the way it travels through households and generations. And the film renders it not as a diagnosis, but as the simple, terrible resemblance between a mother and her son. The red dress carries more weight than a single article of clothing should be able to bear, and the film loads it deliberately. It is the dress Sarah wore to Harry's high school graduation, which means it is a marker of the last moment when her life was full, when she had a husband and a son, and a clear role and a future that still seemed open. To fit into it again is in Sarah's mind, to become that woman again, to reverse the shrinking, to recover the self she has been losing year by year since the dress last fit. The dress is a fixed point of identity in a life that has come unmoored, and the project of fitting into it is really a project of becoming someone she can recognize as and value once more. This is why the goal cannot simply be abandoned when it turns dangerous. To give up the dress is to give up the self it represents, and Sarah would rather risk her body than surrender the last image she has of who she used to be. The film treats this with total seriousness, refusing to reduce it to vanity, because the wish underneath it is not vanity at all. It is the wish to still be somebody, and that wish is the most human thing in the entire film. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Sarah's hunger was never really for the dress. It was for a reason to be seen, and a pill arrived wearing the costume of a cure. In the next section, we go to the diet doctor and the long, documented history of the pills he hands her, a history far darker than Sarah could ever have known. Section 4, the diet doctor. The scene in which Sarah visits the doctor lasts only a moment, and that brevity is the most accurate thing about it. She sits in a waiting room full of women. She is seen for a short consultation. The physician barely looks at her, and she leaves with a prescription for a regimen of pills, color-coded by the time of day she is meant to take them. The film does not name the drugs and does not need to. The public record on the picture and the visible behavior of the pills inside Sarah's body make clear what she has been given. The morning pill is an amphetamine, a stimulant that suppresses appetite and floods the user with energy and a sense of well-being. The others are there to manage the consequences, to bring her down at night so she can sleep, to smooth the edges the stimulant creates. Sarah has walked into a piece of American medical history that was, by the time the novel was written, already notorious, and understanding that history is the only way to feel the full weight of what is being done to her. Amphetamine entered American medicine in the 1930s. Benzedrine, the brand name for amphetamine sulfate, was introduced in 1937 and prescribed for a range of conditions including narcolepsy and mild depression. During the Second World War, the drug was issued to pilots and air crews to fight fatigue, and its capacity to suppress appetite was noticed and quickly turned into a commercial opportunity. As early as 1941, manufacturers were combining amphetamine with other drugs to counteract its side effects and selling the result as a weight loss aid. Over the following decades, these combination products became enormously popular, dispensed through walk-in clinics that operated on an industrial scale. They acquired a nickname drawn from their bright, varied colors. They were called rainbow pills, and they are the direct ancestor of the regimen Sarah carries home in her purse. The rainbow pill was a small chemical machine designed to keep a person taking it. The core was an amphetamine to kill the appetite and lift the mood. Around that core, the clinics added other agents to mask or counter the stimulant's effects and to give the appearance of a personalized medical treatment. The mixtures could include barbiturates and other sedatives to bring the patient down, thyroid hormone to raise the metabolism, diuretics to shed water weight, digitalis, laxatives. A patient would receive a short consultation and walk out with a complicated-looking schedule of differently colored tablets that felt custom-made and was, in fact, a standardized sales pitch. Those who have studied the era describe the clinics filling these prescriptions through compounding pharmacies that often paid kickbacks to the prescribing doctors. The patient believed she was receiving careful, individualized care. What she was receiving was a stimulant wrapped in a costume of medicine with additional drugs included specifically to suppress the warning signs her body would otherwise have raised. The scale of this was staggering. By 1970, by the accounts in the public record, roughly 5% of the entire American population, something on the order of 9 to 10 million people, were using some form of prescription amphetamine, much of it for weight loss. One widely cited drug of the period, Obitrol, approved for obesity in 1960, was a blend of amphetamine salts that included methamphetamine, and it was prescribed freely until its approval was withdrawn in 1973. The dangers were not secret. By the 1950s, the diversion of amphetamines for recreational use was recognized as a serious problem, and by the 1960s, the medical consequences of the diet pill regime, dependence, raised blood pressure, and stimulant-induced psychosis among them were increasingly understood. The drug was simply too profitable and too embedded in the culture for the knowledge to stop the prescribing. Regulation came slowly and against resistance. In 1959, the authorities cracked down on Benzedrine inhalers, making them available by prescription only. The Drug Abuse Control Amendments of 1965 increased oversight of amphetamine use in medical practice, and by the middle of the decade, the inhalers were banned outright. The decisive turn came toward the end of the 1960s, when public attention finally caught up with the death toll. In 1968, a magazine investigation in which a reporter posed as a patient at 10 obesity clinics and was handed more than 1,500 pills, together with a Senate investigation that documented dozens of deaths linked to the Rainbow regimen, pushed regulators to begin pulling the pills from the market. The Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act of 1970 placed amphetamine in a tightly controlled category and imposed real hurdles on its prescription and manufacture. The rainbow pills largely disappeared from the United States in the 1970s, though they would resurface elsewhere and later return in the guise of dietary supplements. This is the history that stands behind the brief scene in the doctor's office, and it transforms the meaning of what looks on the surface like an ordinary medical visit. Sarah is not being treated. She is being processed, the way millions of women before her were processed, by a system that had learned to convert female loneliness and the cultural demand that women be thin into a steady stream of amphetamine prescriptions. The physician's indifference, the speed of the consultation, the failure to explain what the pills actually are or what they will do, all of it is historically exact. The film is dramatizing a real machine that ran for decades and ruined an unknown number of lives, and Sarah is simply one more body fed into it. The phrase that attached itself to this whole phenomenon in the wider culture, the idea of the little helper that got a tired housewife through her day, captures the gentle, domestic, utterly normalized way these drugs were handed out. What the pills do to Sarah on screen is precisely what the pharmacology predicts. At first, the regime delivers everything it promises and more. The weight comes off rapidly. Sarah is suddenly full of energy, cleaning her apartment with manic enthusiasm, grinding her teeth, talking faster, lit up from inside. Aronofsky films an early sequence of Sarah cleaning in fast motion, the amphetamine turning a lonely afternoon into a burst of purposeful activity, and for a while the drug looks like the answer to her whole problem. She is losing weight, she has energy, she has hope, and she has a doctor's blessing for all of it. This is the part of stimulant use that recruits a person, the genuine early reward that makes the drug feel like a gift rather than a threat. The film is careful to show that reward honestly, because Sarah's eventual collapse only carries weight if the audience has first understood why she would keep taking the pills. Then the body adapts, and the regimen begins to fail in the way every amphetamine regimen eventually fails. Tolerance builds. The same dose stops producing the same effect. Sarah frantic to keep the weight coming off, and the energy flowing as the date of her supposed television appearance looms, begins to take more than prescribed. She doubles up. She starts taking the morning pills together, chasing the feeling that the standard dose no longer gives her. This escalation is the universal signature of stimulant dependence, and it is the hinge on which Sarah's story turns from a sad diet into a medical catastrophe. The film tracks it with clinical accuracy because the people who built it understood that the danger of these drugs was never only in the first pill. The danger was in the way the first pill that worked so well created the appetite for the second and the third, until the dose required to feel normal had climbed past the dose the mind could survive. When Harry visits and sees his mother, grinding her jaw and vibrating with chemical energy, he recognizes the signs immediately because he knows drugs from the other side of the family. He tells her the pills are dangerous and pleads with her to see a different doctor, to stop. Sarah refuses, and the refusal is not stubbornness or stupidity. It is the addiction speaking through the dream. The pills have become inseparable from the future she is living for. To give them up would be to give up the red dress, the television, the admiration, the reason to wake up. Harry, who cannot manage his own habit, is in no position to save his mother from hers, and the scene ends with the two of them stranded on opposite sides of a gap that love cannot cross. Sarah keeps the pills. The doctor never reappears to check on her. The machine that history built has done its work, and it has no mechanism for noticing the result. The history that produced Sarah's prescription was, from the beginning, a history aimed largely at women, and that fact is woven into her story, whether the film states it or not. As the decades after the Second World War wore on, the American population grew steadily heavier, while the cultural standard of beauty, particularly for women, grew steadily thinner, and the widening gap between the two created an enormous and profitable demand for anything that promised to close it. Thins had become bound up with a woman's worth, her desirability, her social acceptability, and the diet pill industry positioned itself precisely in that anxiety. The clinics that dispensed amphetamines understood their market. They were selling not just weight loss, but a path back to acceptability, to being looked at with approval. And that is exactly the path Sarah believes she is buying when she goes to the doctor to fit into her red dress. She is a woman of a generation that had been taught her whole life that her body was a project she was failing at, and the pills are sold to her as the solution the culture had been promising since she was young. The genius and the cruelty of the Rainbow regimen was the way it disguised a standardized stimulant sale as personalized medical care. A manufacturer such as Clark and Clark of Camden, New Jersey, one of the early producers of these combination products, could supply a clinic with a range of differently colored pills, and the clinic could hand a patient a complicated, official-looking schedule of tablets keyed to different times of day, creating the impression that a physician had carefully assessed her individual needs and designed a treatment tailored to her body. The reality, as those who have studied the era describe it, was that nearly everyone received the same basic formula, a stimulant to suppress appetite wrapped in a costume of supporting drugs, and that the prescriptions were often filled through compounding pharmacies that paid kickbacks to the prescribing doctors. The patient walked out believing she had received expert, individualized attention. What she had actually received was a sales pitch with the authority of medicine behind it. Sarah's color-coded schedule, the different pills for morning and night, is the visible signature of exactly this system. The personalized appearance laid over the standardized substance. The supporting drugs in the regimen were not incidental. They were the mechanism that kept a patient taking it. The stimulant produced unpleasant effects: agitation, a racing heart, an inability to sleep, and so the regimen included sedatives, often barbiturates, to bring the patient down at night and smooth the edges the stimulant created. Thyroid hormone might be added to raise the metabolism, diuretics to shed water weight, other agents to mask the discomfort that the core drug produced. The result was a self-perpetuating cycle. The morning pill created problems that the evening pills were there to solve, and the evening pills created a sluggishness that the morning pill was there to lift, and a patient could find herself dependent on the whole apparatus, taking pills to counteract the effects of other pills, with the original goal of weight loss buried somewhere cyanide, a chemical routine that had become its own reason for continuing. Sarah enters this cycle innocently, taking what she is told to take, and the cycle does to her what it was built to do. What makes the diet pill history so unsettling, and what gives Sarah's arc its particular horror, is the respectability of it all. The heroine that destroys her son moves through a criminal underworld of dealers and corners and violence, a world that announces its danger in every transaction. The amphetamine that destroys Sarah arrives through a doctor's office, a prescription, a pharmacy, the entire legitimate machinery of American medicine. There is no moment of obvious transgression, no dark alley, no visible crossing of a line. There is only a waiting room full of respectable women, a brief consultation, and a bag of pills handed over with medical authority. The danger is invisible precisely because it is wrapped in legitimacy, and that invisibility is what allows it to reach a woman like Sarah, who would never go near heroin and who has no reason to distrust a physician's prescription. The film places her catastrophe inside the most ordinary and sanctioned setting it can find, and in doing so, it makes the point that the most dangerous drugs in a person's life are often the ones that arrive with permission. The film never names the substances, and the choice is deliberate and effective. It does not need a title card identifying the pills as amphetamine, because the behavior tells the audience everything. The rapid weight loss, the flood of energy, the manic cleaning, the grinding jaw, the sleeplessness, the climbing tolerance, the escalating dose. All of it is the unmistakable signature of stimulant dependence, drawn with such accuracy that a viewer who knows the pharmacology can read the diagnosis in the symptoms. By withholding the name, the film keeps Sarah's experience subjective and human rather than clinical. She does not know what she is taking. She knows only that it worked, and then stopped working, and that she needed more, which is exactly the experience the history describes, multiplied across the millions of people the regimen passed through. Sarah is not an exotic case. She is the ordinary, intended customer of a machine that ran for decades, and the machine processed her exactly as designed. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The pills were never a treatment. They were a stimulant in a costume, the last of a line that the public record links to dependence, psychosis, and death, and Sarah took them because no one told her not to. In the next section, the focus turns to her son and to the very different drug that he and his closest friend believed would buy them a way out. Section 5. The pound of pure while Sarah is being processed by a doctor. Her son Harry is running the more familiar half of the film, the heroin story, and it is worth saying plainly that the film treats this half as the traditional one. Harry, Tyrone, and Marion are walking a road that movies had walked before. The road of young people who use and deal heroin and tell themselves the dealing is temporary, a means to an end, a way to fund the real life that is always just about to begin. What makes their version of the roadland so hard is partly the company it keeps with Sarah's story, and partly the absolute commitment of the people who built it, but the shape of it is classical. They have a dream. The dream needs money. The money will come from heroin, and the heroin will quietly take the dream apart from the inside. Harry and Tyrone are partners, and, more than that, they are brothers in the way that two young men who have survived the same streets together become brothers. Marlon Wayans built Tyrone out of a reading of the novel he had gone through 3 times, and an audition process he had fought through 5 times, and the performance is a revelation, precisely because Wayans had been known for comedy, and here disappears entirely into a young man's mixture of swagger, tenderness, and fear. Tyrone's defining drive is his mother. The film returns repeatedly to a warm, golden-tinted memory of Tyrone as a boy held in his mother's arms, while she tells him he is going to make her proud, and that memory is the engine of everything he does. Tyrone is not chasing a high so much as chasing the man his mother believed he could become, and the distance between that imagined man and the reality of his life is the wound the heroine keeps numbing. Harry's dream is Marion and the store. The plan is straightforward and even admirable on its face. Harry and Tyrone will deal heroin, build up a stake, and use the money to set Marion up with a clothing shop where she can sell the designs she has been making. And the 3 of them Or at least Harry and Marion will step out of the life into something legitimate and shared. Harry believes this. He is not cynical about it. He genuinely loves Marion and genuinely wants the future he describes. And in the summer movement, when the stash and the money are growing, the future looks reachable. The film lets the audience feel the plausibility of it. For a while, Harry and Tyrone are good at what they do. The supply is steady, the profits are real, and the dream of getting out has the solidity of a plan that is actually working. Jared Leto's preparation for Harry has become part of the film's lore, and it speaks to the seriousness with which the whole production approached the physical truth of addiction. Leto spent time living on the streets of New York, among people in the situation his character was in, absorbing the texture of that life from the inside. He starved himself for months and lost around 28 pounds so that Harry's body would carry the visible toll of heroin and malnutrition. Aronofsky asked Leto and Wayans to abstain from sugar and from sex during the shoot so that the appetite and craving in their performances would be genuine rather than acted, a request that sounds extreme until you watch the film and see how completely the two of them embody a state of perpetual wanting. The hunger in their performances is not metaphorical. It was, by the accounts of the production, partly real, manufactured on purpose so that the camera could find it. The mechanics of the heroin high are introduced through the editing technique that would become Aronofsky's signature, and which the next section will examine in detail. For now, it is enough to say that the film renders each fix as a rapid burst of tightly cut images. The spoon, the flame, the liquid drawn up, the needle, the pupil contracting, a flush of relief, all of it compressed into a few seconds and stamped with exaggerated sound. The first time the film shows this, it is almost seductive. The relief on the faces, the visual rhythm, the sheer craft of it communicate why a person would want this. And the film is not afraid to make the high look like a high. That honesty is necessary. A film that made heroin look purely repulsive from the first frame would be lying about why anyone uses it, and Requiem for a Dream is committed above all to telling the truth about how the trap is baited before it is sprung. The dream of getting out through. Dealing rests on an assumption that the film will systematically demolish, which is the assumption that a person can stand close to a drug, handle it, profit from it, and remain untouched by it. Harry and Tyrone are users as well as dealers, and the boundary between the product and their own appetite is porous from the start. Every bag they sell is a bag they could use, and the line between the stake they are building and the supply they are consuming blurs a little more with each transaction. This is the quiet poison inside their plan. The business that is supposed to fund their escape is built out of the very substance they are escaping into, and as their own use grows, the stake stops growing with it. The dream needs the heroin to be a means. The addiction insists on the heroin being an end. The two cannot both win. Tyrone's arc carries an additional weight that the film handles with care, which is the way race and poverty narrow his options from the beginning. Tyrone is a young black man on a Brooklyn corner, with a dream of dignity and an absent ideal of a mother to live up to, and the world the film places him in offers him almost nothing in the way of legitimate ladders out. The heroin trade is, in the brutal logic of his situation, one of the few enterprises actually available to him, which means the path he takes toward his mother's pride runs directly through the thing most likely to destroy him. The film does not lecture about this. It simply shows Tyrone's circumstances and lets the audience feel how the same choice that looks like Recklessness from the outside can look like the only available move from the inside. The turn in the heroine story comes when the supply chain breaks. Tyrone is present at a shooting between rival drug factions, a clash involving organized crime. And although he is innocent, he is arrested in the aftermath. Harry has to spend most of the partnership's saved money to post Tyrone's bail, which wipes out the stake that the dream depended on. Of course, the violence disrupts the flow of heroin into the neighborhood, and a drought sets in. With supply scarce and prices climbing, Harry and Tyrone find themselves in the position every addicted user dreads, needing the drug more than ever, while it becomes harder and more expensive to get. The dream of the store recedes. The plan that was working in the summer is broken by the fall. And from this point, the two young men are no longer building toward a future. They are scrambling to feed a present that is getting hungrier and more dangerous by the day. By the end of the fall movement, Harry and Tyrone have heard of a large shipment coming up from Florida, a chance to buy directly and at scale. But the price has doubled and the risk is severe. The dream has degraded into a gamble, a single desperate play to get enough product to both use and sell their way back to stability. Harry's own body is beginning to show the cost, in a way that the later movements will make unbearable to watch. The warmth of the early partnership, the easy banter, and the shared ambition is curdling into the tension of two users who need a fix and a score and have run out of comfortable options. Tyrone's mother, the golden memory, feels further away with every scene. The heroine that was supposed to be the vehicle of the dream has become the thing standing between the dreamers and any future at all. To understand why the dream of getting out through dealing was doomed from the start, it helps to understand what heroin actually does to the people using it, because the film's traditional heroin story rests on a documented pharmacology that explains everything about Harry and Tyrone's trajectory. Heroin acts on the brain's opioid receptors, producing an intense wave of euphoria and relief, along with a profound sense of warmth and well-being. And it does this so powerfully that the experience can eclipse every other source of pleasure or comfort a person has. The body adapts quickly. Tolerance builds, so that the same amount produces less effect over time, and the user must take more to reach the same place. Physical dependence develops alongside tolerance, so that the body comes to require the drug simply to function normally, and the absence of it produces withdrawal, a documented constellation of misery that includes sweating, muscle cramps, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, insomnia, and an agitation that the literature describes as among the most wretched ordinary human experiences. The user is caught between two forces, the diminishing pleasure of the high and the escalating pain of going without. And as use continues, the second force comes to dominate. People keep using not to feel good, but to avoid feeling unbearably bad. And that shift from chasing pleasure to fleeing sickness is the trap closing. This pharmacology makes the dream of dealing as a means to an end almost impossible to sustain, and the film tracks the failure with precision. Harry and Tyrone are users as well as sellers, which means their product and their need are the same substance, and the economics are merciless. Every bag they use is profit they will never see. As their tolerance climbs, their personal consumption climbs. With it, eating into the steak the dream depends on. The literature on the drug trade describes this pattern as one of the most common reasons that dealing fails to function as a ladder out of poverty for the people who attempt it. The dealer who uses is consuming his own inventory, financing his habit by selling to others while the math of his own dependence quietly bankrupts the enterprise. Harry and Tyrone are not careless or stupid. They are caught in a structural trap that the drug itself sets, in which the means of escape and the agent of destruction are physically identical. The brotherhood between Harry and Tyrone is the warmest relationship in the film, and the warmth is essential to how much the ending hurts. The two young men genuinely love each other in the unspoken way of people who have survived the same hard environment together. They joke, they cover for each other. They share a vision of a future in which they have both made it out. Marlon Wayans, cast against everything audiences expected of him, built Tyrone out of that loyalty, and the performance gives the friendship a tenderness that makes its eventual destruction unbearable. When Harry spends the partnership's savings to bail Tyrone out of jail, the gesture is one of real love, an act of brotherhood that also, in the cruel arithmetic of the film, helps doom them both by emptying the stake. The film keeps showing the affection between them right up to the point where the drug and the circumstances tear them apart, because the affection is the measure of what is being lost. Tyrone's golden memory of his mother is the film's image of the diction is really chasing, and it rewards close attention. The film returns repeatedly to a warm, idealized vision of Tyrone as a boy held in his mother's arms while she tells him he is going to make her proud. And the vision is bathed in a light that no other part of his life possesses. That memory is not just nostalgia. It is the feeling of safety and unconditional love that Tyrone has not had since childhood and cannot recover. And the literature on addiction often describes the pursuit of a drug as, at bottom, an attempt to recover exactly this kind of irretrievable feeling, a warmth and a wholeness that the substance briefly counterfeits. Tyrone is not chasing heroin for its own sake. He is chasing the place in his mother's arms. And the heroin is the only thing that has ever come close to taking him back there, which is precisely why it has such complete power over him. The structural dimension of Tyrone's story deserves to be stated plainly because the film stages it without comment and trusts the audience to see it. Tyrone is a young black man in a poor neighborhood with a dream of dignity and an absent ideal of love to live up to, and the legitimate economy offers him almost nothing. The drug trade, in the brutal logic of his situation, is one of the few enterprises actually available to a person in his position, which means the path he takes toward his mother's pride runs directly through substance most likely to destroy him. The film does not present this as a personal failing. It presents it as a trap built by circumstances Tyrone did not choose, a world that withholds every legitimate ladder and then condemns the people who climb the only one left. When the supply chain collapses and Tyrone is swept up in a shootout he had no part in, and arrested despite his innocence, the injustice is of a piece with everything around him. The system that offered him no way up is now positioned to lock him away, and the dream of his mother's pride recedes into a future that the heroine and the circumstances have together placed permanently out of reach. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Harry and Tyrone believed they could touch the drug and stay clean of it, sell the dream, and keep their own dream intact. The supply broke, the stake vanished, and the trap began to close. Next, the focus turns to Marion, and to the way addiction reaches past the body to take a person's dignity and their love. Section 6. Marion and the cost of the high. Marion Silver is the character through whom the film makes its case about what addiction does to intimacy and to the self, and Jennifer Connelly's performance gives that case a devastating human face. Marion comes from money. Her parents are well off, and the film implies a childhood in which she was given material comfort in place of attention, leaving her with resources she has rejected and a hunger for connection she has not been able to fill. She is talented. She designs clothes, and the designs are real, the product of an actual creative gift that the film treats as genuine rather than as a pretext. Her dream, shared with Harry, is the store where those designs would be sold. A life built around making things and being loved. In the summer movement, that dream and that love both look real and reachable. And Marion is, for a while, happy. Connolly's preparation mirrored the intensity of her castmates. She rented an apartment in the building, where her character was meant to live, and isolated herself there, painting, listening to the music she imagined Marion would listen to, and designing clothes, some of which became the character's actual wardrobe in the film. She spoke with people who had struggled with addiction and attended narcotics, anonymous meetings alongside a friend in recovery, working to understand not just the behavior of addiction, but its origins, the emptiness underneath it. She has described the experience of making the film as draining and sad and hard to go through, and that difficulty is visible on screen as something earned rather than performed. Marion's descent is the hardest of the four to watch in some respects, because it is the most intimate, the most bound up with shame and the body and the loss of the self. The film establishes the love between Harry and Marion with real tenderness, which is necessary because the whole point of her arc is the way addiction hollows that love out. There is a scene early on, filmed in split screen, in which Harry and Marion lie together and touch, the divided frame holding each of them in a separate panel even as they share the same bed and the same moment. The technique is doing something precise. Even at their closest, even in a scene of genuine affection, the two of them are shown as fundamentally separate, divided by the same line that will widen into a chasm as the drug takes over. The split screen that elsewhere in the film marks suspicion or distance is used here, in a loving moment, to plant the quiet warning that these two people are already alone together, each sealed in a private panel, reaching across a divide that the heroine will eventually make uncrossable. As the heroin drought sets in and money runs short, the cost of the high begins to fall on Marion in a particular and gendered way. Harry, needing money and product, turns to the one resource the situation seems to offer, which is Marion's body. He encourages her to go to her psychiatrist, a man named Arnold, played by Sean Gillette, who has shown an interest in her, and to trade sex for money. The film is unflinching about the corrosion this introduces into the relationship. Harry loves Marion, and is, at the same time, willing to sell her to feed the habit they share. And Marion goes along with it, partly out of her own need for the drug, and partly out of the terrible logic of a couple in which both partners are addicts, and the addiction has become the senior partner in every decision. The request is the beginning of the end of them. It poisons the love it was supposed to be in service of, and both of them know it, even as it happens. What the film is dramatizing here is one of the most documented and most destructive features of severe addiction. The way it reorganizes a person's entire hierarchy of values around the substance. Things that were once unthinkable become thinkable, then necessary, then routine, not because the person's character has collapsed all at once, but because each step is only slightly worse than the last, and each is justified by the overwhelming pressure of need and withdrawal. Marion does not decide one day to abandon her dignity. She makes a series of small, pressured choices, each one framed as temporary. each one a little further down than the one before, and the cumulative effect is a slide she cannot see the bottom of from any single step. The psychiatrist is the first transaction. He will not be the last. Marian's shame is filmed with a particular tool in the film's later movements, the body-mounted camera that keeps her face fixed in the center of the frame, while the world tilts and lurches around her. When Marian walks home after selling herself, the camera is strapped to her so that she remains horribly still at the center of the image while everything behind her swims, a visual rendering of dissociation, of a person who has left her own body because what is happening to it is unbearable to inhabit. The effect is not pleasant to watch, and it is not meant to be. It puts the audience inside the specific quality of Marian's degradation, the way she is present and absent at once, performing the transaction, while some essential part of her has gone somewhere else. The documented reality of how trauma and shame produced dissociation, the sense of watching oneself from outside, is rendered here in pure cinema without a word of explanation. The relationship between Marian and Harry deteriorates in step with the supply. Withdrawal makes them sick and irritable and cruel. The tenderness of the summer gives way to the snapping, scrabbling tension of two people who need a fix and are taking their need out on each other. The store, the designs, the shared future, all of it recedes into a fiction that neither of them quite believes anymore, but neither can fully abandon, because abandoning the dream would mean admitting what they have actually become. Marian clings to the designs even as her life falls apart around them, the sketches and the fabric piling up unused, monuments to a self she is losing. The gap between the woman who rented an apartment to immerse herself in her craft and the woman selling herself for a bag of heroin is the whole distance the film is measuring. There is a documented truth underneath Marian's arc that gives it its weight beyond the specifics of her story, which is the way addiction so often pushes people, and women in particular, towards sex work and exploitation as the habit outruns their income. When the drug costs more than a person can earn or steal by other means, the body becomes the last available currency. And the people positioned to take advantage of that, the Arnolds, and later the more frankly predatory figures, are always there. Marian's slide from a talented young designer to a woman trading sex for drugs is not a melodramatic invention. It follows a path that the literature on addiction describes again and again. The path by which the substance, once it has claimed a person's resources, comes for their dignity and then for their sense of themselves as a person who has limits at all. By the time the film reaches its winter movement, Marian has agreed to go further still, into arrangements with a pimp named Big Tim and the group degradations he arranges. In exchange for the drugs she can no longer live without. That descent belongs to the film's final convergence and will be returned to in a later section. What matters in tracing Marian's arc to this point is the trajectory itself, the way a dream of love and creative work, held by a genuinely talented young woman, is converted step by pressured step into its opposite. Harry's request that she sell herself is the moment the conversion becomes visible, the moment the audience understands that the heroine has taken not just Marian's health and her future, but the relationship that was supposed to be the reason for all of it. The cost of the high, the film insists, is never only physical. It is paid in love, in self-respect, in the slow surrender of everything a person once refused to give up. The science of why addiction destroys intimacy gives Marian's arc a foundation beneath its emotional power. Drugs like heroin act directly on the brain's reward system, the same circuitry that in ordinary life makes human connection feel good, that rewards a person for closeness and bonding and love. When a drug floods that system far more powerfully than any natural experience can, it begins to outcompete the natural sources of reward, and over time the brain comes to prioritize the chemical above everything else, including the people a person loves. The relationships that once provided comfort and meaning start to feel pale and insufficient next to the drug, and the drug steadily takes the place that other human beings used to occupy. This is the process the film dramatizes in Harry and Marion. Their love is real, and the early scenes show it as real. But the heroine is slowly rewiring both of them to value the next fix above each other, and the relationship that was supposed to be the reason for everything becomes, by degrees, an obstacle to the only thing that now matters. The film does not explain this in clinical terms. It simply shows the love curdling, and the documented science is what stands underneath the curdling. A couple in which both partners are addicted is a particular and well-documented trap, and the film captures its dynamics with painful accuracy. When two people share an addiction, the addiction becomes the senior partner in the relationship, the silent third party that makes every important decision. Each enables the other. Each provides cover and company and justification for use that might be harder to sustain alone. And when the supply runs short and the need grows desperate, the couple will make decisions together that neither might make in isolation, because the shared compulsion overrides the individual conscience. Harry's suggestion that Marion sell herself is the product of exactly this dynamic. It is not simply Harry choosing to exploit Marion. It is two addicts, governed by a shared need, arriving at a decision that the addiction has effectively made for them, with both of them complicit and both of them diminished by it. The film refuses to let either of them off the hook, and refuses to make either of them a simple villain or simple victim, because the reality of a dual addiction is that responsibility and harm are tangled together in ways that resist clean assignment. The choice to cast Sean Gillette as Arnold, the psychiatrist who becomes Marion's first paying client, carries a quiet resonance for anyone who knows Aronofsky's work. Gillette was one of the director's closest collaborators, the star of his student thesis film, and the lead of Pi, a trusted presence from the beginning of his career. Placing that familiar collaborator in the role of the man who first purchases Marion's body gives the character an uncomfortable ordinariness. Arnold is not a monster from outside Marion's world. He is a respectable professional, a therapist, someone positioned to help her, who instead takes advantage of her desperation. The casting underlines what the film keeps insisting, that the people who exploit the addicted are often not lurid criminals, but ordinary figures of authority and respectability, and that the slide into degradation is greased as much by the respectable as by the openly predatory. Marion's background gives her descent a specific shape. She comes from money and has cut herself off from it, living a life her wealthy parents do not understand or approve of. And the film implies that her childhood was one in which material comfort stood in for genuine attention, leaving her with resources she rejects and a hunger for real connection she has never been able to satisfy. This is the wound that Harry and the heroine both speak to. Harry offers her love, and the drug offers her relief, and for a while, the two together seem to fill the absence that her family's money never could. The tragedy is that both of those sources of comfort are unstable, and as they fail her, Marion is left with nothing to fall back on, having long ago severed the privileged safety net she was born into. Her estrangement from her parents, which looked like independence in the summer, becomes isolation in the winter, and there is no one left to catch her. The designs that pile up unused in Mary's apartment are the externalized image of the self she is losing. They are evidence of a genuine creative gift, the product of real talent and real work, and they represent the version of Marion who was going to make things and build a life around making them. As the heroine takes over, the designs stop being a future and become a relic, sketches, and fabric accumulating in the corners of a life that has stopped moving toward anything. By the end, when Marion lies clutching her drugs amid the crumpled, discarded designs, the image is unbearable, precisely because the designs are still there, still beautiful, still evidence of who she could have been, scattered around the body of who she has become. The creative self has not been destroyed, so much as abandoned, set aside for a chemical that promised more and delivered ruin, and the gap between the woman who made those designs and the woman lying among them is the whole distance the film has measured in her, the slow surrender of everything a person once refused to give up. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Marion's gift, her love, and her dignity were all spent feeding a need that kept demanding more, and the split screen that once held a tender moment widened into a wall. In the next section, we step back from the four stories to look at how the film itself was built, and how its form was engineered to put the audience inside the experience of the high. Section 7. The machinery of the high Requiem for a Dream is one of the most formally aggressive films ever to reach a wide audience, and its technique is not decoration. Every stylistic choice in the picture is engineered to put the viewer inside the nervous system of addiction, to make the audience feel something close to what the characters feel, rather than merely observing it. Understanding the machinery is essential to understanding why the film works on people the way it does, why it lodges in the memory and the body, and why it has been imitated for a quarter of a century without ever being equaled. The director who built this machinery was a young filmmaker with one feature behind him, and a determination to find a visual language for an internal experience that most films had only ever described from the outside. The most famous of the film's techniques is the rapid montage that Aronofsky himself named the hip-hop montage, a sequence of extremely short shots, each only a fraction of a second, stitched together with exaggerated sound effects to compress an action into a burst of sensation. The film uses this for every instance of drug use. A fix becomes a string of half-second images, the dilating or contracting pupil, the lighter's flame, the liquid coming to a boil, the syringe, the rush of blood, each stamped with its own loud, stylized sound. The shots go by too fast for the conscious mind to fully process, and just slow, enough to register, which produces a physiological rather than intellectual response, a quickening, a flush, a flicker of the same arousal the characters are feeling. The technique was first developed in Pi, and refined here into the defining signature of Aronofsky's early work, later carried into films like Black Swan. The sheer density of the editing is part of the effect and is genuinely extreme by the standards of mainstream cinema. A typical feature of around 100 minutes contains somewhere between 600 and 700 cuts. Requiem for a Dream contains more than 2,000. The editor, Jay Rabinowitz, assembled this enormous number of pieces into a rhythm that accelerates as the characterized lives accelerate toward collapse, so that the film's pace and the addiction's pace climb together. The repetition of the drug montage matters as much as its speed. The first time the audience sees the ritual of the fix, it is novel and even thrilling. By the 10th and 20th time, it has become rote, mechanical, drained of pleasure, which is exactly the trajectory of addiction itself. The way the ritual that once delivered ecstasy dulls into a joyless compulsion, performed simply to stave off the sickness of going without. The form teaches the audience what tolerance feels like by inflicting a version of it on them. The split screen is the film's second major device, and it is used to dramatize disconnection between people who occupy the same space. When Harry and Marion lie together, the divided frame holds them apart even in intimacy. When Sarah hides behind her chained door from her son, the line down the screen makes their separation literal. The technique insists again and again that these characters are alone even when they are together, sealed each in a private compartment, reaching across a divide that the drugs keep widening. It is a visual statement of one of the film's central truths about addiction, that it isolates, that it turns shared rooms into parallel solitudes, that the person sitting beside you can be somewhere you cannot reach. The body-mounted camera, often called the Snorri-cam, fixes the actor's face and torso in the center of the frame while the entire background moves, producing a queasy, unmoored sensation of a person standing still while the world reels around them. The film deploys this rig most powerfully in its third act, on Marion in her shame as she walks home from selling herself, on Tyrone in his terror, on Sarah in her panic. The device renders the specific feeling of dissociation, of being trapped inside a self that has come loose from its surroundings, and it does so without a single line of dialogue. Alongside it, the film uses long tracking shots, extreme close-ups that turn a pupil or a needle or a mouthful of coffee into an enormous and obsessive image, and time-lapse photography that compresses Sarah's amphetamine-fueled days into juddering accelerations. The cinematographer Matthew Libatique, working on his early collaboration with Aronofsky, gave the whole film a palette that turns sickly as the story darkens, the warm orange of the Coney Island summer souring into something fluorescent and cold. The film borrowed and invented freely in service of these effects. Aronofsky has acknowledged that one of the bathtub sequences was inspired by the Japanese animator Satoshi Kon's 1997 film Perfect Blue, a work concerned with the dissolution of identity, and the influence is fitting for a film so preoccupied with people losing their grip on who they are. The visual effects, roughly 150 of them, were produced by a small company that Aronofsky formed with friends, which is to say the most technically dazzling drug film of its era, was assembled on a modest budget by a tight group of people improvising solutions. During one grocery store sequence, real people struggling with addiction were brought in as background performers, and the director has recalled that some of them were injecting during the filming, a detail that collapses the distance between the film's subject and its making in an uncomfortable way. The music is the final and perhaps the most enduring piece of the machinery. The score was composed by Clint Mansell, a musician who had fronted a band before turning to film scoring and who had worked with Aronofsky on Pi. The centerpiece is a composition called Lux Eterna, a phrase that means eternal light, performed for the recording by the Kronos Quartet, a string ensemble formed in San Francisco in 1973. The piece functions as a recurring theme throughout the film, returning in different arrangements and building toward the finale, where it swells as the four characters reach their separate bottoms. Mansell has described it as essentially a monster theme, and has recalled that Aronofsky framed the whole film as a kind of horror movie in which, every time the addiction wins, it is a victory for the monster. The music is, by the composer's own account, deliberately heavy and insistent, and that quality, which a more experienced filmmaker might have toned down, is exactly what gives it its grip. The afterlife of that music is a story in itself, and says something about how completely the film entered the culture. A re-orchestrated version of Lux Aeterna, expanded with a full choir and orchestra, and titled Requiem for a Tower, was created for the trailer of The Lord of the Rings. The Two Towers in 2002, and through that trailer the theme reached an audience vastly larger than the film itself. From there, it spread into countless other trailers, advertisements, and even sporting events, becoming a kind of universal shorthand for mounting dread and inevitable confrontation. There is a strange irony in the fact that a piece of music written to score the destruction of 4 addicts became, for many people, simply the sound of epic tension, detached entirely from the despair it was built to express. The melody that accompanies Sarah's mind coming apart and Harry's arm rotting became background music for movie marketing, which is its own small parable about how culture strips meaning from the things it borrows. What all of this machinery accomplishes, taken together, is a film that does not argue against drugs so much as simulate the experience of being captured by them. The acceleration of the cuts mimics the acceleration of dependence. The repetition of the fix mimics the deadening of pleasure into compulsion. The split screen mimics isolation. The body camera mimics dissociation. The souring palette mimics the draining of joy. The relentless, building music mimics the sense of a force gathering that cannot be stopped. The film bypasses the part of the brain that weighs arguments and goes straight for the part that feels, which is precisely why it has been used for decades as a deterrent, and why people who have seen it tend to describe the experience in physical terms, as something that happened to their bodies rather than something they merely watched. The technique is the message. The form is the warning. There is a real neuroscience underneath the famous drug montage, and understanding it reveals how precisely the technique mirrors what it depicts. When a person uses a drug, the brain releases a surge of dopamine, the chemical at the center of the reward system, and the brain does not only register the drug itself. It registers everything surrounding the drug, the objects and actions and sensations that accompany the high, and it learns to associate those cues with the reward that follows. The spoon, the lighter, the rolled bill, the needle, the dilating pupil, all of these become conditioned triggers, capable on their own of producing craving and anticipation before any drug has entered the body. The hip-hop montage is built entirely out of these conditioned cues. It is a catalog of the exact objects and actions that an addicted brain has learned to crave, assembled and accelerated, and stamped with sound, which is why the sequences produce a physiological response in viewers who have never used the drugs depicted. The film is reproducing, in the audience's own nervous system, the conditioned arousal that the ritual produces in the user, teaching the body what a trigger feels like. The repetition of the montage performs an even subtler trick because it simulates tolerance. The first time the film runs through the ritual, it is novel and charged and almost thrilling. By the 10th and 20th repetition, the same images and the same sounds have lost their charge, becoming mechanical, drained, something to be endured rather than enjoyed. This is precisely the trajectory of the reward system under chronic drug use. The brain, flooded repeatedly with artificial dopamine, dials down its own sensitivity so that the same drug produces less and less pleasure over time, and is eventually taken not for the high but to escape the flatness and sickness of going without. The film inflicts a version of this deadening on the audience through sheer repetition, so that by the later movements, the montages feel joyless and grim, exactly as the drug has become joyless and grim for the characters. The form does not describe tolerance. It administers it. There is genius in what the montage chooses to show and what it withholds. It does not show the high itself, the subjective interior experience of euphoria, which is essentially unfilmable. It shows the ritual that precedes the high and the body's immediate reaction to it, the pupil, the flush, the exhale, and it lets the audience's mind fill in the experience between. By cutting straight from cause to effect and omitting the middle, the film makes the high present without ever depicting it, which is both more honest and more unsettling than any literal representation could be. The editor Jay Rabinowitz, who assembled the film's more than 2,000 cuts, has been described as bringing an obsessive attention to detail that suited the material perfectly, and observers of the production have noted that this obsessiveness mirrored the very fixation the film is about. The person cutting a film about compulsion was himself working compulsively, chasing the precise rhythm of each montage with a focus that the subject seemed to demand. The music carries its own history that deepens its effect. Clint Mansell had come to film scoring from the world of rock music, having fronted a band before his collaborations with Aronofsky, and Requiem for a Dream was early in a film career that was still finding its shape. The piece he built, Lux Aeterna, was performed for the recording by the Kronos Quartet, a strings ensemble formed in San Francisco in 1973 that had spent decades winning acclaim for adventurous work across classical and film music. Mansell has credited the quartet with breathing life into the composition, with making it more than its notes, and the collaboration produced something that functions less like a film score in the conventional sense, and more like a recurring presence, a theme that returns in shifting arrangements throughout the film and gathers force as the story darkens. Mansell has spoken about how Aronofsky framed the entire film as a kind of horror movie, a story in which the addiction is the monster, and every time the addiction wins it counts as a victory for the monster, and about how Lux Aeterna became, in that framing, essentially the monster's theme. The music is the sound of the thing that is hunting all four characters, and it grows louder and more insistent as the thing closes in, until it swells to full force in the finale as the four of them curl into their separate corners. What unites all of these techniques is that none of them sits on the surface as decoration. Each one is doing the work of putting the audience inside a state rather than showing them a state from outside. The conditioned cues of the montage produce craving. The repetition produces tolerance. The split screen produces isolation. The body-mounted camera produces dissociation. The souring color produces the draining of pleasure. The monster's theme produces the sense of an approaching doom that cannot be argued with or outrun. Taken together, they make a film that does not lecture the viewer about addiction, but instead conscripts the viewer's own nervous system into a controlled experience of it, which is why the film has been used for decades as a deterrent and why people describe watching it in the language of something done to them. The craft is not in service of beauty or spectacle. It is in service of a warning delivered below the level of argument, straight to the body. Before we move on, If you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The film was engineered, frame by frame and beat by beat, to make an audience feel the pull and the deadening of the high from the inside. With that machinery understood, we return to the characters and to the place where the dream stops rewarding and starts attacking. Next, we go to Sarah and to the documented science of a mind coming apart under the weight of the pills. Section 8. When the dream turns, on her the amphetamine that gave Sarah Goldfarb her energy and her hope does not keep its promises, and the way it turns on her is one of the most clinically accurate portraits of stimulant psychosis in any popular film. As her tolerance climbs and she escalates her dose to chase the effects that the standard regimen no longer delivers, Sarah crosses a threshold that the medical literature describes with grim consistency. Heavy or prolonged amphetamine use, especially at high doses, and combined with the sleeplessness the drug produces, can push a person into a psychotic state, a break from reality marked by paranoia, delusions, and hallucinations. Sarah is not a recreational user seeking a thrill. She is an elderly woman taking ever larger doses of a stimulant prescribed to her as medicine. And her descent into psychosis is the direct, predictable consequence of a regimen that no one is monitoring. The documented features of amphetamine psychosis map almost point for point onto what happens to Sarah. The condition commonly produces persecutory delusions, the conviction that one is being watched, mocked, threatened, or plotted against. It produces hallucinations across the senses, with visual hallucinations being especially characteristic of drug-induced psychosis as opposed to other psychotic conditions. It produces what clinicians call ideas or delusions of reference, the experience of ordinary events, a broadcast on a television, a sign on the street, as carrying special personal significance, as being addressed directly to the sufferer. And it produces, in many cases, a particular and horrifying tactile hallucination called formication, the sensation of insects crawling on or beneath the skin, sometimes severe enough that people scratch themselves, raw trying to remove bugs that are not there. The high dose, the daily use, the sleep deprivation, all the accelerants the literature identifies are present in Sarah's situation in full measure. The film renders her psychosis as a slow invasion of her apartment by the contents of her own mind. The television, which has been Sarah's faithful companion through her loneliness, stops staying behind the glass. The self-help host, Tappy Tibbins, and the studio audience begin to spill out of the set into her living room, real and physical and addressed to her, jeering and applauding, and turning her private collapse into a broadcast spectacle. This is the delusion of reference, made literal, the lonely woman's deepest wish. To be on television, to be seen and addressed by the bright world inside the screen, twisted by the drug into a nightmare in which the screen comes for her and will not leave her alone. The thing she wanted most has become the engine of her terror, which is the exact mechanism by which the film argues that the dream and the disease were always the same. The refrigerator is the film's most indelible image of Sarah's psychosis, and it is worth dwelling on because of how precisely it externalizes her condition. Sarah, starving herself and wired on amphetamine, becomes terrified of her own refrigerator, the source of the food she is denying herself, and the symbol of the appetite the pills are at war with. In her hallucinating mind, the appliance becomes animate, lurching toward her across the floor, growling, threatening, a hulking enemy in her own kitchen. The refrigerator hallucination is pure cinema, an absurd and frightening image that would be ridiculous in a lesser film, and is, here, genuinely disturbing because it captures the way psychosis takes the ordinary furniture of a life and charges it with menace. The body-mounted camera and the souring color and the relentless score all converge on Sarah in these scenes, putting the audience inside a mind that can no longer tell the difference between a kitchen appliance and a predator. Sleeplessness is the accelerant beneath all of this, and the film is precise about it, even when it does not name it. Amphetamine suppresses sleep, and the regimen Sarah is on has her taking pills designed to bring her down at night. But as her use spirals out of control, the careful balance the rainbow regimen was supposed to maintain collapses. A person who is not sleeping, who is flooded with stimulant, whose appetite is being chemically suppressed, while the drug strips away the mental buffers that normally let a person process strange experiences, is a person primed for exactly the break that overtakes Sarah. The medical literature is clear that high-dose stimulant use, combined with sleep loss, is among the most reliable routes into psychosis, and Sarah travels that route in full view of an audience that has watched her get there one reasonable seeming step at a time. What makes Sarah's psychosis unbearable rather than merely frightening is that the audience has followed her every step from loneliness to hope to dependence to collapse, and so the breakdown does not arrive as a horror movie shock, but as the grief of watching a specific, beloved person disintegrate. Burstyn's performance refuses to let Sarah become a spectacle of madness. Even at the height of the psychosis, there is a frightened, confused old woman underneath the hallucinations, a person who only wanted to wear a red dress and be admired, and who cannot understand what is happening to her. The film never loses sight of that person. The hallucinations are extreme, but the suffering is intimate and real, and the gap between the small, bright wish that started all this and the terror it has become is the whole tragedy compressed into a single ruined mind. Eventually, the psychosis drives Sarah out of her apartment entirely. Unable to bear the waiting any longer, frantic and confused, she leaves home and travels into Manhattan to the offices of the casting agency, determined to find out when she will finally appear on the television show she was promised. The journey is harrowing. An old woman in deep crisis, moving alone through the city. And when she arrives, she is not the picture of a winner ready for her television debut, but a disoriented, deteriorated figure in obvious distress. The dream that began with a phone call has carried her, by the logic of the drug, to a reception desk in a strange office in a state of psychiatric emergency. The staff who encounter her see what is plainly in front of them, a woman who is not well, and the machinery of a different institution begins to take hold of her. Sarah is admitted to a psychiatric ward. The film does not soften this. The vibrant, hopeful woman of the summer movement is now a patient, frightened and confused and far from home, surrounded by strangers in a clinical setting that has no idea who she was before. Her friends Ada and Ray do not know where she has gone. Her son is occupied with his own collapse hundreds of miles away. Sarah has arrived at the place that the entire arc was secretly pointed toward from the moment she escalated her dose, and she has arrived there alone. The dream of being seen has delivered her, at last, into a system that sees her only as a case, a body to be managed, a problem to be treated. What the treatment will be, and how the film's depiction of it relates to the documented reality of that treatment, belongs to the convergence of the winter movement. The deepest cruelty of Sarah's story is that nothing she did was unreasonable from where she was standing. She wanted to lose weight for a television appearance. A goal the culture had taught her was normal and achievable through medicine. She went to a doctor and took what she was prescribed. When the prescribed dose stopped working, she did what tolerance pushes nearly everyone to do, and took more. Each step followed from the last. There was no single moment of recklessness, no obvious bad decision, only a slope that looked level until she was already sliding down it. That is the warning the film delivers through her, and it is a different and in some ways more frightening warning than the one delivered by the heroine story. Sarah's catastrophe was built from the most ordinary materials a life contains: loneliness, a dream, a culture that sells pills as solutions, and a medical system willing to hand them over without ever asking what they would do. There was no needle in it, no corner, no criminal underworld, nothing that announced itself as danger. The drug at the center of Sarah's collapse has a longer history than the diet pill era alone, and that history underscores how thoroughly its dangers were understood by the time she was prescribed it. Amphetamine was first synthesized in the late 19th century and manufactured in 1893, initially explored for conditions like asthma and nasal congestion. And over the following decades, its uses multiplied across medicine even as its capacity to derange the mind became steadily clearer. By the time Sarah takes her pills, the medical literature had documented stimulant psychosis for many years. This was not an obscure or unforeseeable outcome. It was a known endpoint of heavy amphetamine use, described and studied and understood, which makes the casual way the drug was dispensed to women like Sarah all the more damning. The catastrophe that overtakes her was sitting in the medical record the whole time, waiting for anyone willing to read it. The numbers attached to stimulant psychosis place Sarah firmly within a documented pattern rather than at some melodramatic extreme. Studies of stimulant users have found that a substantial fraction experience psychotic symptoms, with some research suggesting the figure may reach as high as half of those who use these drugs heavily. And emergency department data has indicated that a meaningful share of people presenting with amphetamine toxicity arrive with psychosis already underway. More sobering still, the literature suggests that roughly a third of individuals who develop amphetamine-induced psychosis may eventually convert to a diagnosis of schizophrenia, the psychosis having either unmasked or precipitated a more permanent condition. Sarah is not an outlier invented for dramatic effect. She is a textbook case of a documented phenomenon, an older woman pushed by escalating doses and mounting sleeplessness into a break from reality that medicine has seen countless times. One detail of her presentation is itself a clinical clue. Her hallucinations are heavily visual, and visual hallucinations are relatively uncommon in schizophrenia, while being characteristic of drug-induced psychosis, which is exactly the kind of distinction clinicians use to recognize that a psychosis has a chemical rather than a primary psychiatric cause. The specific shape of Sarah's delusions matches a documented feature of the condition with eerie precision. Clinicians describe what they call ideas or delusions of reference, the experience of perceiving ordinary external events as carrying special, personal significance, of believing that messages are being broadcast directly to oneself through a television or a radio or a sign on the street. This is not a loose description of Sarah's experience. It is an exact one. Her conviction that the television is addressing her, that the host and the audience are speaking to her and about her, that the bright world inside the screen has turned its attention toward her, personally, is the delusion of reference rendered on film, and the cruelty of how the film stages it lies in, where the delusion draws its material. Psychosis does not invent its content from nothing. It weaves a person's deepest preoccupations into the break, and Sarah's deepest preoccupation is the dream of being on television, of being seen and addressed by that bright world. The drug takes the exacting thing she wanted most and turns it into the instrument of her terror, so that the wish and the nightmare become the same image. There is a further symmetry that the film exploits with quiet devastation. The self-help gospel that primed Sarah, the relentless program about willpower and winning and mastering the self, returns in her psychosis as the voice that mocks her. The host, who once promised transformation, now jeers at her from inside her own apartment. The audience that once seemed to offer admiration now laughs at her collapse. The culture that sold her the idea that she could conquer her body through sufficient willpower becomes, in her broken mind, the chorus celebrating her failure to do so. The film could not state more clearly that the dream and the disease were always entangled. The same television, the same host, the same fantasy of being seen are present at both ends of her arc, first as the hope that started everything, and finally as the hallucination that ends it. Sleeplessness is the engine that drives the whole process, and the film is precise about its role even without naming it. Amphetamine suppresses sleep, and the medical literature identifies sleep deprivation as one of the most reliable accelerants of stimulant psychosis. A brain deprived of rest for long enough loses its capacity to regulate perception and to test its own experiences against reality. And a brain in that state flooded simultaneously with stimulant is for exactly the break that overtakes Sarah. As her use spirals and the careful balance of her regimen collapses, she stops sleeping, and the not sleeping feeds the psychosis as much as the drug itself does. The frantic energy that looked like vitality in the early movement was always borrowed against this, against the rest her body needed and was being denied. And when the debt comes due, it comes due all at once, in a mind that can no longer tell a kitchen appliance from a predator, or a television program from a tribunal assembled to judge her. The film offers no villain to blame for any of this, which is part of what makes Sarah's unraveling so frightening to watch. There is no dealer, no pusher, no figure of obvious malice anywhere in her story. There is only a lonely woman, a culture that taught her to wage war on her own body, a doctor who wrote a prescription and moved on, and a chemistry that did exactly what chemistry does. The psychosis that takes her mind is the predictable output of an ordinary machine, and the ordinariness is the horror. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The pills that promised Sarah a future drove her instead into psychosis and into a psychiatric ward alone, with no one who loved her aware of where she had gone. In the final stretch before the end, the focus turns to winter, the season with no thaw, where all four characters arrive at the bottom of the line at once. Section 9, Winter. The third movement is titled Winter, and it is here that the film gathers its four separated stories and drives them to their conclusions, at once, cutting among the characters so their collapses rhyme and amplify one another. The structure is the cruelest stroke of the design. By braiding the four bottoms together, the film denies the audience any single place to rest, because every story the camera turns to is in its own final crisis. The seasons have run out exactly as the calendar promised. Winter is the end. Sarah's winter is the psychiatric ward and what is done to her there. Having failed to respond to medication, she is given electroconvulsive therapy, and the film stages it in its most frightening possible form. as a brutal assault on a helpless, uncomprehending old woman. The documented reality is worth flagging because the film leans on an older and more terrifying image than the modern procedure supports. The treatment was developed in the late 1930s by the Italian neurologist Ugo Cerletti and his colleague Lucio Bini, and first administered in 1938. In its earliest decades, it was performed without anesthesia or muscle relaxants, and in that form it could fracture bones and erase memory, and it earned a fearsome reputation that fiction has kept alive ever since. The modern treatment, standard since the decades after the 1960s, is performed on an unconscious patient whose muscles are relaxed so the seizure produces no convulsion, and the medical literature regards it as effective for severe depression that has resisted everything else, with side effects that are mostly temporary. The film reaches for the older horror rather than this contested clinical reality, and that choice has to be named rather than taken as documentary. What is not in dispute is the gravity of Sarah's condition, and the film's image of her afterward, hollowed and absent, is its expression of how far she has been lost. When Ada and Ray finally find her and sit weeping on a bench outside the hospital, two old women confronting the ruin of their friend, the human weight of her destruction lands harder than any clinical scene could. Harry's winter is his arm, and here the film is documentary in its accuracy. A wound at the injection site has festered into gangrene, the exact progression the medical literature describes for people who inject drugs. Repeated injections with dull or unsterile needles drive bacteria into the tissue, commonly Staphylococcus aureus and Streptococci, and an abscess forms, present by some estimates in up to a third of injection drug users. From there, infection can spread as cellulitis, kill the tissue, and become gangrene, in its worst form a rapidly spreading necrotizing infection that often arises from a left arm injection site and can seed the blood and the heart. Driving south to Florida for one last desperate score, Harry and Tyrone stop at a hospital where the physician recognizes the arm of an addict and calls the police. Both are arrested. Harry's arm is amputated above the elbow, and he wakes to a gentle nurse, promising that Marion will visit, and he weeps because he already knows she will not come, that the future the two of them dreamed is gone along with the limb. Tyrone's winter is a southern jail, where he is subjected to forced labor and to abuse from racist guards while suffering the full agony of heroin withdrawal with no relief. The film does not flinch from the racial dimension, and it should not, because the documented reality is that the system absorbs enormous numbers of people whose fundamental problem is medical and social, and processes them through cages and contempt, the burden falling hardest on poor men of color. His loyalty to Harry, the warmest thing in the film, has delivered him here, sick and degraded, and as far from his mother's arms as the world can put him. Marion's winter is the deepest degradation the film depicts. With Harry gone and the drug she cannot live without, demanding more than she can otherwise get, she turns to the pimp Big Tim, who supplies her in exchange for performing in a group event for an audience of men. The film stages this as the absolute bottom of her descent, rendered through the body-mounted camera and the relentless cutting, as a nightmare she is barely present for, and it holds the audience in it long enough that there is no pretending it is anything less than it is. The talented designer who once rented an apartment to immerse herself in her craft debases herself completely for a single bag of heroin. The convergence is the film's argument made flesh. Sarah hollowed out in a hospital, Harry weeping over an amputated arm and an absent love, Tyrone sick and abused in a cell, Marion degraded for a fix. 4 people who began with 4 sympathetic dreams, 4 ordinary hungers to be loved and seen, all arriving in the same season at the bottom of the same pit, each alone, each having lost the very thing the dream was about. The film cuts among them faster and faster as the score builds, refusing to let any single collapse stand apart, insisting they are all one story, the story of a dream that becomes a hook, and a hook that pulls a person all the way down. Winter has no thaw. It simply arrives for all of them at once. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. 4 dreams, 4 people, 1 winter that turned everything each of them reached for into the instrument of their ruin. 1 image remains, repeated 4 times, that gathers the whole film into a single gesture. In the final section, we sit with the fetal curl, and with everything Requiem for a Dream has been trying to say. Section 10, the fetal curl. The film ends with an image it gives to each of its 4 characters in turn, and the repetition is the point. As the score swells to its full weight, Sarah, Harry, Tyrone, and Marion each curl into a fetal position, drawn in on themselves, the posture of an infant and of a person seeking the last possible comfort when none is left. 4 ruined adults in 4 separate places, folding into the same primal shape at the same moment. The fetal curl is the body's instinctive retreat, the thing a person does when there is nothing else to do, and the film lays the 4 images side by side and lets the audience feel the awful symmetry of it. Each final moment is laced with a last flicker of the dream that destroyed it, and the flickers are exact. Each person retreats toward the very dream that ruined them. Marion lies clutching the drug she degraded herself to obtain, surrounded by the crumpled clothing designs that represented the creative life she abandoned for it. Harry, maimed in his hospital bed, reaches in his mind for the love he sacrificed to feed the habit, for a Marion who is not coming. Tyrone retreats into the golden memory of his mother's arms, the safety and pride he spent his life trying to recover and lost forever in the chasing. And Sarah, hollowed by her treatment, escapes most completely of all, into a perfected version of the dream that broke her, imagining herself triumphant on television with a healthy, successful, loving son walking onto the stage to embrace her. The film ends inside her delusion of a reunion the real world can never grant, the lie the addiction tells made visible one final time. This is the film's thesis delivered without a word of explanation. The dream and the drug were never separate things. The dream was the first drug and the most powerful one. The hunger the chemical only ever served. Sarah wanted to be loved and seen, and the want became the hook that pulled her into the pills, and the psychosis and the ward. Harry and Marion wanted a shared life and a creative future, and the want pulled them into the heroin that took Harry's arm and Marion's dignity. Tyrone wanted his mother's pride, and the want pulled him into the trade that pulled him into a cell. The fetal curl is what is left when the dream has consumed the dreamer. The film offers no recovery, and the choice is deliberate. There is no redemption, no character who gets clean, no thaw after the winter, and the structure with its 3 seasons and no spring announced this from the start. Some have called the film too relentless, a parade of suffering with no air in it, and the criticism is not unreasonable on its own terms. The relentlessness is the argument. The film withholds the comfort most addiction stories provide, the comfort of a bottom that becomes a turning point, because the people who made it wanted to show the version of addiction that does not turn. The version is the takes that takes and takes until nothing is left. Requiem for a Dream premiered at Cannes in May of 2000, out of competition, and opened in the United States that October. It arrived carrying a rating controversy that became part of its identity, assigned the most restrictive adult rating available and released unrated rather than cut, a decision that limited its theatrical reach and preserved its uncompromising form. It found its real audience over the following years on home video, passed from one viewer to the next with warnings about how hard it is to watch. Ellen Burstyn received Academy Award and Golden Globe nominations for Best Actress, a remarkable acknowledgement for a film this punishing, and though she lost the Oscar that year to Julia Roberts for Erin Brockovich, her Sarah Goldfarb has come to be regarded as one of the great screen portraits of addiction and loneliness. The work proved a turning point for the people who made it. Jennifer Connelly won a supporting Oscar the next cycle. Jared Leto would win. 1 year later, the cinematographer became a 2-time nominee, and Aronofsky carried his techniques forward into the films that followed. There is a detail in the making that returns the whole thing to its origin. Hubert Selby Jr., the writer whose own life supplied the documented reality the film draws from, appears in a small role as a laughing prison guard, taunting Harry, the man who lost his lungs and most of 2 decades to addiction, who wanted to be a composer and became the author of a Requiem, who got clean in 1967 and refused morphine on his deathbed despite real pain, stood on the set of the film made from his book and played a guard, laughing at a young addict's suffering. He died in 2004 of the lung disease that had been killing him since he was 19. He had written the story of people who could not stop, and he had personally been one of the few who did. What Requiem for a Dream warns about addiction, in the end, is not simply that drugs are dangerous, a thing every viewer already knows walking in. The warning is more specific. Addiction begins with a hunger long before it involves any substance. The universal human hunger to be loved, to be seen, to be lifted out of a small or lonely or painful life into something larger. The substance, whatever form it takes, a needle or a pill or a dream of television, is only ever the thing that promises to feed that hunger and devours the person instead. The most reasonable, ordinary wishes a person can have are exactly the ones most easily turned into hooks. None of these 4 wanted ruin, and all of them found it by reaching for relief through a thing that kept its promise just long enough to make itself necessary. The film leaves 4 people curled in the dark, and it leaves the rest of us with the knowledge that the distance between an ordinary dream and that curl is shorter than anyone wants to believe. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.